I am 100 years old. I have outlived almost everyone who was there. The men I fought beside, the men I watched die, the men who died trying to reach me, most of them have been in the ground for decades. I am still here, which is something I have never fully understood and have long since stopped trying to explain. What I can explain, what I have owed to the truth for 80 years, is what I saw from that bunker on the morning of June 6, 1944. Not the version in the history books. Not the version in the films. What I actually saw, standing at my gun aperture, watching the horizon go dark. My name is Heinrich Brauer. In June 1944 I was 20 years old. Assigned as a machine gunner at Strong Point, went 6-2 on Omaha Beach, manning an MG-42 in a concrete bunker that commanded the beach below. I had been told, we had all been told, that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. 2,400 kilometers, a fortified coastline from Norway to the Spanish border. 17 million cubic meters of concrete. 1.2 million tons of steel. 8 concrete bunkers at our position alone. 35 pillboxes. 4 artillery positions. 85 machine gun nests. The beach below us had been planted with 3,700 obstacles, Belgian gates, Czech hedgehogs, wooden stakes topped with mines. Behind us, 6.5 million mines. Field Marshal Rommel himself had inspected our positions. He had looked through my gun aperture, studied the overlapping fields of fire, and nodded. "When they come," he said, "this beach will be their cemetery." I believed him. I had been believing people like him my entire adult life. It was the only thing I knew how to do. 3 days before the invasion, I wrote a letter to my girlfriend back home. "The invasion will be their grave," I wrote. "We will throw them back into the sea within hours." I had Rommel's words in my head when I wrote that. I had the concrete of the bunker around me, 3 feet thick, designed to withstand naval bombardment. I had the MG-42 with its 1,200 rounds per minute, the overlapping fields of fire, the obstacles on the beach, the mines behind me, the artillery batteries that could theoretically deliver 120 rounds per minute into any landing sector. I had all of this, and I was 20 years old, and I had no idea what was coming, and nobody had told me, and possibly nobody knew. The night of June 5th was calm, almost serene. The channel was dark and quiet through my gun aperture. The weather had been bad for days. Wind speeds of 20 to 25 knots, 6-foot waves, low cloud cover. Our meteorologist in Paris had assured High Command that conditions would remain poor for at least 2 weeks. Based on this forecast, senior officers had left their posts. Rommel himself had departed for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, carrying a pair of grey suede shoes he had purchased in Paris. General Dolman had ordered division commanders to attend war games at Rennes. Naval patrols that normally swept the channel had been cancelled because of rough seas. I did not know any of this at the time. I knew only that the night was quiet and the channel was dark, and I had cleaned my gun barrel and was thinking about the letter I had sent and whether she had received it yet. What I did not know, what nobody in my position could have known, was that the Allies possessed weather stations in Greenland and weather reconnaissance flights over the Atlantic that had detected a 36-hour break in the storm, a window. Group Captain James Stagg had identified it. Eisenhower had seized it. While we slept, in our concrete certainty, 6,939 vessels were moving toward us through the dark. 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 864 merchant ships, the largest naval armada ever assembled in human history, and it was moving toward my gun aperture in the dark, and I was asleep, and nobody had told me it was coming, and by the time I understood what I was looking at, it would already be too late. At 0530 hours, the first grey light began to show over the channel. I was at my position, eyes at the aperture, watching the darkness thin, and then I saw it. I have been asked to describe this moment many times in 80 years, and I have never found words that are fully adequate. So I will simply tell you what happened in my body before my mind could process it. My hands stopped moving, my breathing stopped. The world around me became very quiet and very still, in the way that things become quiet and still when the mind encounters something it does not have a category for and does not know how to file. The horizon was black with ships, not a few ships, not a fleet, in the sense that I had imagined fleets, a formation of vessels with spaces between them, a military arrangement that could be counted and assessed. The horizon, from one end to the other, as far as I could see in either direction, was covered with ships. They covered the surface of the water the way clouds cover the sky. Artillery officer Bernhard Hickling, at our position, reportedly told his men that they were witnessing the whole world arriving on their doorstep. I did not have words that orderly. What I had was the physical sensation of understanding something that my training and my confidence and my concrete bunker and Rommel's nod of approval had not prepared me for. This was not a military calculation. This was not something that could be repelled by overlapping fields of fire and carefully ammunition. This was a fact of nature. This was the tide. At 0535 hours, the naval bombardment began. Nothing in my experience had prepared me for what followed. The USS Texas alone fired 25 of its 14-inch shells at Puenque in 34 minutes. Hum's Warspite opened fire at approximately 0500 hours and would deliver over 315-inch shells in the first 2 days. The noise was not what I expected from artillery. It was below the range of what I would call sound. It was pressure, physical pressure, arriving through the concrete floor and walls and into my chest before the airborne sound reached my ears. The bunker, which I had believed to be invulnerable, cracked in places. Men were buried, dug out, and buried again as shells continued to fall. The fortifications in which we had placed absolute confidence were absorbing punishment that the engineers had promised they could not absorb. They were still standing, but I had felt them shake, and something in my understanding of the situation had shifted in a way that I could not put back. Then, at approximately 0930 hours, I watched the Luftwaffe's response. I had been promised air superiority over any invasion. We had all been promised it. What arrived was to aircraft, to Oberstleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, had been ordered to attack the invasion fleet with his entire force. His response, recorded in the Wings War Diary, was, "What entire force? I have 2 planes." The Luftwaffe, which had sworn to darken the skies over any Allied landing, managed 319 sorties on D-Day against 14,674 Allied sorties. Priller and his wingman made the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches during the morning, a single strafing run over Sword Beach, before they fled from overwhelming Allied fighter cover. 2 aircraft against thousands of ships and tens of thousands of men. I watched for our aircraft that morning from my aperture. I watched for a long time. They did not come in the numbers we had been promised. They did not come at all, in any meaningful sense. The sky above the invasion belonged entirely to the other side. and it had apparently always been going to belong to them, and nobody had told me. At 0635 hours, the first assault waves hit the beach below my position. I opened fire. What followed, I have spent 80 years trying to understand, in a way that does justice to the complexity of what it actually was. I was doing my job. I was a soldier in a defensive position under attack. And I operated my weapon the way I had been trained to operate it, in short, controlled bursts, 1,200 rounds per minute, traversing the aperture, managing the ammunition, keeping the barrel from overheating. I will not tell you what I saw through that aperture. I will tell you only what mattered strategically, which is this. I fired 13,500 rounds over 9 hours. My gun barrel warped from heat, and the Americans kept coming. This is the thing that broke something in me that morning. Not the bombardment, not the sight of the fleet, but this, the mathematics of what I was watching. No matter how many fell, more appeared. Every destroyed landing craft was replaced by 3 more. Every position that was silenced was suppressed by naval gunfire that had no apparent limit. I was watching an arithmetic problem that had only one answer, and the answer was not the one my commanders had written in their assessments, and it was not the one I had written in my letter 3 days earlier. The beach that Rommel had called their cemetery was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a proof, a demonstration, conducted at enormous cost to the men on both sides of my aperture, of a truth that the Atlantic wall and the concrete and the fields of fire and the 3,700 beach obstacles had been constructed specifically to deny. By midday, we were reporting critical ammunition shortages. The defensive plans had calculated ammunition expenditure based on repelling a limited assault. Nobody had planned for this scale. Nobody had planned for the scale of anything that was happening that day. Positions that had ammunition calculated for a 3-day battle exhausted their supplies within hours. Artillery batteries faced the same crisis. The carefully husbanded stocks that represented months of allocation and transportation disappeared under the intensity of combat. Attempts to bring forward reserve stocks failed. Every road was under constant Allied fighter-bomber attack. And I watched, from my aperture, as American destroyers fired hundreds of shells at single targets, while by afternoon our artillery was rationed to 4 shells per gun per day. 4 shells. I had been given 13,500 rounds for my machine gun, and I had used them all. And the Americans were still coming, and our artillery had 4 shells per gun. And the destroyers offshore were firing hundreds at individual targets without apparent concern for conservation. The armor reserve that Rommel had insisted must defeat any invasion on the beaches remained paralyzed through the critical morning hours. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to intervene, did not receive orders to attack until 1,000 hours, 4 hours after the landings began. When they finally moved at 1620 hours, they reached the coast by 1900 hours, and witnessed the arrival of 250 gliders bringing British reinforcements. Interpreting this as a threat to their flanks, they withdrew, having lost 54 tanks in a single day. The counterattack that was supposed to drive the invaders back into the sea had driven itself back instead, confused by its own command structure, paralyzed by Allied air power, and outmatched by a form of warfare it had never been designed to face. I did not know the details at the time. I knew only that no armor came, that the hours passed and the ammunition ran low and the waves kept landing, and nothing came from behind us to change the arithmetic. As darkness fell on June 6th, the surviving defenders took stock. The impregnable Atlantic wall had been breached in multiple places. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a meaningful force over Normandy. The Kriegsmarine had managed to sink 1 destroyer while losing 15 I-boats and numerous smaller craft. General Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Division, which had borne the brunt of the British assault, reported to 7th Army Headquarters, Division combat strength 35%. All coastal strongpoints lost. Artillery 90% destroyed. Enemy advancing inland. In a single day, forces that had spent years constructing the most fortified defensive line in military history had been reduced to 35% strength, and the Allies were landing fresh troops with the regularity of a supply chain. Because that is what it was, a supply chain, a logistics operation, an industrial process that had been running since before any of us had taken our positions on the wall. The days that followed confirmed what June 6th had demonstrated. Every German movement at night was detected by radar, illuminated by flares, destroyed by artillery or naval gunfire. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, stationed near Toulouse, took 17 days to reach Normandy, a journey that should have taken 3 days. They arrived, having lost 30% of their vehicles to air attack without firing a single shot at ground forces. Units that should have reinforced us within hours arrived weeks late, depleted before they engaged anyone, destroyed on roads by aircraft that owned the sky so completely that daylight movement had become effectively impossible. Meanwhile, Allied logistics operated with an efficiency that made our own supply situation look like a different century. Within days of D-Day, the Allies were landing 15,000 tons of supplies daily, more than the entire German army in Normandy consumed in a week, delivered across open beaches by a system that had been engineered specifically for this purpose. Operation Cobra, on July 25th, completed what June 6th had begun. 1,580 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, 550 fighter bombers, dropping over 4,100 tons of bombs in a concentrated area. General Fritz Behrlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division, reported to Army Group B, "My division is annihilated. The psychological effect on the survivors is indescribable. They are no longer soldiers, but broken men." The bombing was so intense, it killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, who was observing from what was believed to be a safe distance. If American generals were not safe from their own firepower, what chance did any of us have? The Falaise Pocket in August became the final accounting. 10,000 Germans killed, 50,000 captured, 300 tanks destroyed, 2,500 other vehicles, roads carpeted with dead horses and burning equipment, Allied fighter bombers attacking in waves every 20 minutes. Many soldiers simply surrendered, preferring captivity to the certainty of death from an enemy who could apparently continue this indefinitely. The final numbers of the Normandy campaign tell the story in the language that the campaign itself spoke. German losses from June 6th to August 31st. Approximately 320,000 casualties, 2,300 tanks destroyed. Virtually all armor in France gone. Allied losses, 229,000 casualties, with replacements exceeding losses daily. Approximately 4,000 tanks lost and replaced within weeks. 4,101 aircraft lost from a force exceeding 13,000. General Marshal Rommel's chief of staff wrote afterward, "Normandy proved that courage alone could not overcome industrial supremacy. We faced an enemy who had mechanized not just warfare, but victory itself." Rommel, in his final report to Hitler on July 15, 2 days before being severely wounded by Allied aircraft, wrote, "The troops are fighting heroically everywhere. But the unequal struggle is nearing its end. The enemy's overwhelming superiority in men and material is beginning to tell. I must beg you to draw the necessary conclusions without delay." It was military language for a sentence he could not write directly. The war is lost. Germany's most celebrated commander, telling Hitler in formal military prose that everything was finished, and Hitler refusing to hear it. "I am 100 years old, and I have had 80 years to understand what I witnessed on June 6, 1944. And I will tell you what I believe now that I could not have told you then. The Atlantic Wall was not a defensive fortification. It was a story told in concrete and steel to men who needed to believe they were protected, and to an enemy who needed to believe they faced something insurmountable. Rommel understood this better than anyone. He had demanded 60 million mines for the Normandy coast and received 6.5 million. He had demanded armor positioned at the water's edge and been refused by commanders who believed the tanks must be held in reserve. He had looked through my gun aperture and nodded. And I believe now that what he saw was not a cemetery for the invaders, but a position that would delay them, not stop them, and that he knew the difference, and that the difference was everything. What defeated us was not the bravery of the men on those landing craft, though they were brave in ways I have respected for 80 years. What defeated us was the ships. The 6,939 ships that turned the horizon black. The American factories that produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944. The Ford plant at Willow Run that completed one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. The supply system that was landing 15,000 tons daily across open beaches within days of the invasion. The destroyers that fired hundreds of shells at individual targets while our artillery was rationed to 4 rounds per gun per day. These were not tactical decisions. They were production statistics. They were the output of a society that had mobilized its industrial capacity for war in a way that no amount of concrete or tactical brilliance or individual courage could have answered, because it was not a question of courage. It was a question of mathematics, and the mathematics had been settled in the factories of Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania long before the first landing craft touched the sand at Omaha Beach. I fired 13,500 rounds. On June 6, 1944, my gun barrel warped from heat. When it was over, when the ammunition was gone, and the position was untenable, and the Americans were moving inland, and the wall that had been called impregnable had been breached, in the first hours of the first day, I sat in my bunker surrounded by 13,500 empty shell casings, and I wept. Not from fear, not from grief, exactly. From the specific overwhelm of a 20-year-old who has understood, all at once, that everything he was told was wrong, that the impregnable wall was permeable, that the Luftwaffe that was supposed to darken the skies had sent 2 planes, that the armor that was supposed to drive the invaders back into the sea had driven itself backward, that the ammunition calculated for a 3-day defense had lasted hours, that the horizon, from one end to the other, was still black with ships, and the ships were still unloading, and they were going to keep unloading, and there was nothing, no concrete, no field of fire, no MG-42, no calculation, no letter home promising victory that was going to change that. I am 100 years old. I met American D-Day veterans in the years after the war, men who had been on those landing craft, crossing the beach below my position on that morning. We sat together, old men by then, and we talked about what we had each seen from our different positions on the same Beach, on the same morning, we had been trying to kill each other. We had been young men thrown into an industrial slaughterhouse that neither of us had designed or chosen, serving systems whose full nature neither of us had understood at the time. My 13,500 rounds had meant nothing against their unlimited replacements. Their courage had been real. My courage had been real. None of it had been the point. The point had been decided in factories and shipyards and oil refineries, decided by production statistics and supply chains and a weather 6-hour break in the weather that a British meteorologist had identified and a supreme commander had seized. And all the rest of it, the concrete, the mines, the overlapping fields of fire, the letter I wrote about their cemetery, had been a story that the facts had simply walked through as if it were not there. I stood on the Atlantic Wall on June 6, 1944. The horizon turned black with ships. I knew, in the way you know things, that your body understands before your mind does, that death had arrived. I was wrong about whose death it would be. It was the death of the last illusion I had ever held about the war I was fighting and who was going to win it.